Good morning. It's News from the Roots on Mountain Stream TV. Today is Wednesday, July 10th, 2019. And we have a guest with us this morning. It's John Moore, who is a board member of the Canary Coalition currently. But John wears many hats, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit today. Um, so thank you for coming, John. And
Thank you for having me.
yeah. And so why don't you tell us a little bit? One thing I know about you is that you tried to run for city council in Hendersonville last year.
I did. So this happened in 2017. I ran for city council in Hendersonville, North Carolina. So we're about an hour away from that here in Silva. But in 2016, I was like a lot of other young people. I wasn't quite pleased with the outcome of the election. A lot of the things that I cared about, the environment, education, healthcare, a lot of those things were at risk. But as a young person with a little bit of political experience, I wanted to find a way that I could begin healing what some wrongs that I thought had happened in the last year, and how I could begin to counteract some things, at least at the local level. Working on issues of the environment, affordable housing, more equality and diversity, and how our government was set up. I would have been, I ran as, I would have been the youngest person ever elected in the state of North Carolina, but we ran into a little bit of issues. So when I first filed, when I first looked at filing in 2017, I ran based off our city's charter, which it had some very simple qualifications. All you had to do is be a registered voter, a resident of the city, and a resident of the city of Hendersonville. And to be a registered voter, that simply means that you're a person who is 18 years of age and older. And of course, to be a resident, it just means that your house, your apartment, your townhome, wherever you're living, is inside the limits of the city of Hendersonville. And I met all those requirements. So after filing with the Board of Elections, it took about 2 weeks. We filed, the official filing date, I believe, was July 5th or 6th sometime in 2017. So about mid-July, we got a summons to the Henderson County Board of Elections, where we found that there were some provisions in our state constitution that may restrict me from running at the age that I was. And I want to preface this by saying I was 19 years old. I actually filed on announced my candidacy on my 20th birthday. So I was 20 at the time. But the statute that they were looking at in the state constitution, and we kind of had some conflicts with this, but it was looking at House and Senate races, and it was saying that the age to run for office was 21 years of age, and I just turned 20. So that became a big conflict with us. I had a attorney out of Asheville at a very good law firm, Roberts and Stevens, PA. His name is John Noor. He engages in a lot of pro bono work, and he has a very he's local. He's native here in Asheville. He went to UNCA for undergraduate. He went to the UNC School of Law at UNC Chapel Hill, and he's done a lot of distinguished work throughout Western North Carolina, and he decided to take up my case. Unfortunately, at the time, we ran into a lot of red tape. So after I found out I'd been rejected to run by our local board of elections, the General Assembly, the North Carolina General Assembly, and Governor Cooper were in a court case because the North Carolina General Assembly, after 2016, they were doing a lot to restrict the powers of the governor at that time. Pat McCrory was just unseated Republican by a Democratic governor, or then Attorney General Roy Cooper. So there's a little bit of retribution going on, and there was some the setup of our state board of elections. There were some disagreements between the General Assembly and the governor on how that usually a majority of the members belong to the party of the governor, and the minority belongs to the other party. And that had flipped, and there were changes that the General Assembly wanted to make to kind of restrict the governor's power on the state board of elections. Since the governor refused to appoint members to the state board of elections, so we were in an instance where we were filing a grievance with the state board of elections that actually did not exist. It had no members. So we've tried to file injunctions with both the North Carolina Court of Appeals and the North Carolina Supreme Court. The process for filing election grievances in the state of North Carolina is you go through your local board of elections, your county board of elections, your state board of elections. You can appeal that at the North Carolina Court of Appeals, and if you still have issue, you can take that all the way to the North Carolina Supreme Court. But there's a provision in there that's called administrative secession. So if you're not able to follow one of those steps, the next body is not able to hear your case until a lower body has heard that. Well, it took well into the first part of 2018 for the State Board of Elections to be reconstituted. So we were not able to get our case heard in court, but I did carry on my campaign all the way to Election Day in November. And since I could not get on the ballot, we did run a write-in campaign.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Where we got over 60 people to write.
That's awesome.
To write me in as a candidate for city council. And the most interesting part of that is 60 people in a small election, municipal election, actually represents 2% of the vote. So a lot of, there's a provision in North Carolina that actually if you get 2% of people on a ballot initiative, you actually get put on the ballot. Or if during a primary, if you get 2% of the electorate to write you in, during that general election, you then earn your name on the ballot. So that
Earn your name on the ballot when?
So let's say you have three or more candidates, and there are 2 seats that are open on your local city or town council in the primary.
Yeah.
If you have a candidate who, let's say, they're a fairly new resident and they don't quite meet the residency requirements yet, they can do a provision to where they are a write-in candidate during that primary, and if they receive 2% or more of the vote, then they earn their way to getting their name on the ballot.
It's a nonpartisan election.
It is a nonpartisan election.
So the primary didn't have to do with the Democrat or Republican.
It did not have to do with Democrat or Republican.
I see. So you got onto the ballot for November?
So I wasn't able to get onto the ballot. But the amount of votes that I garnered as a write-in candidate, if I was permitted to run, it would have met that 2% threshold to put my name on the ballot.
Interesting. Okay. So, yeah. Oh, that's fascinating.
But it was a good experience, and I hope if it showed people anything, I hope a lot of young people looked at what we did and may have been influenced to run for offices at a younger age.
I wonder, of course now the voting age is 18,
right,
and everybody who's 18 is eligible to vote if they register. I wonder the law that prohibits anybody under 21 from holding office in North Carolina, I wonder if that law predates the date when the voting age became 18.
Well, it actually did, and it was changed. So I believe when we were looking at our state constitution, there had been a change where the age was 21. And I believe this happened sometime in the 70s or 80s, if I'm not mistaken. It happened as a result of the Vietnam War. So a lot of people throughout the country were saying, if you're 18 years old, you can sign up for selective service and be drafted into war, then you should have the right to vote. So
or hold office. It seems to me. I mean, that's not in the constitutional amendment, but yeah.
So unfortunately that didn't change. So when the law was changed, reducing the voting age from 21 to 18, it seems like it was just left out in the Constitution where that age to run for office didn't become lowered with the voting age.
Yeah, it
in
should
the,
have.
in the 70s.
But so that's a good basis on which to challenge that law.
Right, right.
I think, which is, I'm sure it's probably what you did, but,
Right.
and so is that still, has such legislation been introduced?
So there has been legislation introduced in the past to help reduce the age to run for office. Unfortunately, it hasn't been successful. It actually, I think it was introduced for the first time, whether it was 2014 or 2015, and it actually failed on the floor by one vote, on the floor of the North Carolina House.
So it came to a vote on the floor?
It did come for
And
a vote on the floor of the
by
House,
one vote.
and it failed by one vote.
So we got to reintroduce that.
So it can be reintroduced. Unfortunately, after we finished this whole process, we tried to look to see if there were, we could garner any more support in the House. So there have been a lot of changes since 2014, 2015. So members of the House have changed. The original sponsor of that legislation had changed. And it seemed as if support in the House wouldn't have been as strong as it was then to supporting that piece of legislation. And
even after this last election in which the
even after-
Democrats made gains?
well, I have not talked to Democratic legislatures since the last general election in 2018, so that perhaps may be another good thing to bring up in the future.
Yeah.
But looking at the past bill in 2014, 2015, it was a voting bill attached with a lot of other, in Raleigh and Washington it's called PORC, so other voting issues involved in it that I think actually brought the bill down as a whole. So potentially doing a bill that is just focused on reducing the age of running for office may be more successful in the future. So it's something to look into for sure.
Yeah, I hope that works out because that makes a lot of sense. This day and age, young people have more at stake than ever before, I
Right,
think,
right.
in
So-
government policy and.
Right, and the most unfortunate thing about that is, as young people, we're not as apt to run for office, we're not as apt to vote or to follow real big issues that impact us. So I believe if we saw a system that was more conducive to seeing young people run, and I think if that could be accompanied by strong campaign finance reform, where if you're a student or if you're a person who's just going into the real world, into having your first job, you can still have the opportunity to run for office because even for state house and senate, salaries are only $7,000-8,000 a year, so you're going to need some kind of job to supplement that.
Right, it's not much of a
And,
job.
Right.
It does provide health care, though, right?
It does provide
Yeah.
health care. For city council races, you're just getting base pay of $5,000. So I think there's a lot that we could do on a state level to make it more conducive for young people to run. I think some of the shifts that we're seeing in the House and the Senate are positive because they seem to be people who want to expand voting rights. Again, some of the restrictions that we've seen in the last few years under a Republican supermajority. So I think we could see more progressive changes, and I think again, like you said, since we have a new composition of the House and the Senate, this may be a worthwhile initiative going forward.
Yeah. So, what are some of the other campaigns that you've been involved in?
So I first got involved with North Carolina politics, like a lot of people my age, in 2014, with the working for the campaign for Kay Hagan running for the United States Senate. Unfortunately, that didn't work out the way that we wanted to, but it kind of gave me my first, experience working as a field organizer. So in 2015, 2016, during the Democratic primary, I worked as a field organizer for Bernie Sanders.
Oh, you did?
After the primary, I worked worked for the Consolidated Campaign here in Western North Carolina for Hillary Clinton, primarily working in minority areas
Mhm.
here throughout the state. So, um,
So-
in the 2018 election, I went into my first role as in management, campaign management, and we managed a state house race in Henderson County. Um, and
for
our candidate was Gail Kemp in Henderson County, based out of Fletcher, and she was running against Representative Chuck McGrady.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that was an interesting
Hard
race.
Republican district, pretty much.
It is a very red district, and there are so many unique things about this race, and the most unique of which is Representative McGrady has been in the General Assembly for almost a decade now, a little bit more than a decade after he retires, and Gail, in the campaign that we ran, ended up being the very first Democratic opponent he has ever had since he's been in office, and it's been several terms since when he's run unopposed without even a libertarian candidate running against him. So in the end of that campaign, there's a lot of information that other candidates in the future can learn about that district, specifically left-leaning, progressive, or Democratic candidates in that district can learn, because Gail ended up garnering 38% of the vote. So with a little bit more strategy, perhaps a little bit more money going into the district, which is not a very good reality, but money certainly helps when elections a lot
Especially
more.
on the day of the election, getting the vote out,
Right,
is
right.
so important. That is,
Especially.
and some of these elections, especially in primary elections, but even in the general election, the voter turnout is so low,
Until election day.
especially on an off-year election, when there's
Right.
nobody running for president or governor.
Right.
That getting your vote out can make the difference between
Absolutely.
winning and losing.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Getting out the vote efforts, perhaps maybe being able to put more funds into getting organizers out into the street and helping with canvassing efforts. There's a lot of progress to be made in the district she was running in, and I think there's that much progress that can be made in districts across North Carolina. Just the data needs to be examined, and we've got to have candidates who will be brave enough to run for those offices.
It's true. It's unusual for someone your age to be this involved in politics. What do you attribute? Why have you chosen to do that? Does your family have a history of political involvement?
That's the interesting part. The first time both of my parents voted for president, and at this time, in 2000, the first time they voted for president was in 2009.
Wow.
Which was, they voted in the primary and the general election for Barack Obama.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, they were in their late 40s, just turning 50 in 2009. So I came from an African American family that didn't really have any reason to vote, or had people to vote that looked like them or really carried their interest. At least that's what they felt until 2009. I'm happy to say every primary, every general election since then they've participated in.
That's great.
So I think you'll see that from a lot of minority and black communities and black families that in 2009, 2008, 2009, the conversation that was being had on a national level now about having an African American in the highest office in our country sparked something in those communities and started, I think, a really good upward trend, and having them come out to vote. But for me, when I was so I don't come from a family or with a really big social activist background, or what really got me interested in politics was studying social justice. So I was a really big fan. I was a really big fan of Martin Luther King when I was young. Some kids ask for video games and things like that on their birthday or for Christmas. I remember on Christmas when on Christmas, it may have been 2006 or 2007, I told my dad I wanted a large picture of Martin Luther King, so that's what I got. It's about this big. He sits in my living room in my apartment now. Or taking trips to the King Center was our family summer vacation for me, because I was so inspired as a young black man, where at the time we didn't have Barack Obama when I was young. So seeing a role model like that, and I knew that I had a little bit of an interest in politics and social activism, even when I was young, that was a big person that I looked up to. And one of the biggest things that Dr. King advocated for was, of course, like working towards the 1964 Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. So I knew that being involved in politics, that was my most powerful way of continuing the changes that people I looked up to wanted to foment in our country. So that's really what got me into politics. In school, I really loved the social sciences, so in social studies, history, government. And I took some of those higher level advanced placement courses throughout high school, and they're some of my favorite courses in college now too.
So I just want to go back and touch on something you mentioned. You said before 2009 or 2008, when Barack Obama ran for president, your parents had never voted in a presidential election, and because they didn't feel like they had anything to vote for.
Right.
And is that purely a matter of identity politics, or is it because of what Barack Obama stood for?
Well, I think it's a mix of both. I think, unfortunately, identity politics plays a lot into it, but when you live in a country where people are running for offices to represent you, but they don't look like you, they don't understand the experiences particularly as a black man or woman, or as a Hispanic family, or as an immigrant family. If you don't see representatives in your community or running for state or federal office who can really relate to your background and thus understand more the issues that you and your family have, and it then results in better advocacy on those issues. I do believe there was some identity politics that played a role in that. But I think and this kind of spawned from the 2004 Carrie Edwards campaign, which really brought the issue of healthcare back up because
Edwards in particular, yeah.
Edwards in particular, and since the failures of trying to reform healthcare in the 90s, that ticket really brought that issue back to the forefront of Democratic politics. And I think in 2008 that people were really looking for someone who could really impact that issue. And I know especially it was for my family as well. And I think the argument that Barack Obama gave for reforming healthcare, and I think the trust that people had in him, and in particular my family, that he would have on that issue. And I think some people would like to see us go further for Medicare for all. They'd like to see a public option, but I think he gave us, and as he explains it, a great starter home for having universal health care in our country with the ACA. And I think a big role that I think healthcare played a very big role in my family, and I think other families who were impacted with high deductibles, high insurance premiums. They wanted someone who would make a big change on that issue, and I think Barack Obama was just someone that they believed could make that change.
Of course, I mean, with the Affordable Care Act, there are still big deductibles, there are still co-pays, and there's still 30 million people who are not insured.
But I think there's there's also a provision in there that
there are subsidies.
There are subsidies,
yeah.
But also there's a provision that That,
Pre-existing conditions, you mean?
um,
Yeah.
well, it wants states to expand Medicare,
Yeah.
and it gives states funding to do that, and it would help cover a broader group of people who are what they fall in what they call the donut hole. So they make too much to get subsidies, but they make too little to afford have an affordable rate for them and their family. So it would cover people in that donut hole under an affordable Medicare
But
plan.
it also allows states to opt out of
It
that,
allows
which
states
is
to opt
what
out.
we're experiencing here in
It's-
North Carolina.
And we know right now that Governor Cooper and the majority party and the General Assembly are having what seems to be productive discussions right now over the budget and trying to get funding for Medicaid expansion here in the state of North Carolina, and it's looking very promising. Research has come out that in the state of North Carolina, if Medicaid is expanded, it would not only would it create thousands of jobs in the healthcare industry across our
40,000
state,
is what I understand. Yeah.
but it would also help cover those people who fall in the donut hole, and that would be over 634,000 people across the state of North
That's
Carolina.
amazing. Yeah.
So
What a criminal act not to take advantage of
absolutely,
that.
absolutely,
Yeah.
and looking at the budget that Governor Cooper has put forward, you're able to increase education in the state of North Carolina, so education funding, and which includes teacher pay and per pupil spending, would go up under Governor Cooper's budget, including Medicaid expansion, in which a large amount of that money would come from the federal government. And we're able to do all this without raising taxes on the people of North Carolina and making sure we keep a balanced budget. So I think it's fiscally responsible, and I hope if anyone's watching this who's watching this and is passionate about healthcare, that you get out your pen and paper, or you get out your cell phone and you call your legislature, your member of the House, your member of the Senate. You write them a letter, you call their office, and you ask them to support Medicaid expansion, because it's so important to so many families, and I'm sure it's important to a lot of the viewers' lives personally.
Okay.
So
So you mentioned that after Obama ran in 2016, you started working for the Bernie Sanders campaign.
2016, I started working for the Sanders campaign.
And why did you choose Bernie Sanders to vote for?
Well, I chose Bernie Sanders because I'd seen the progress that we made over the last 8 years under Barack Obama. But I knew in a lot of core critical issues, we needed to see a lot more political courage than would have been shown on them. And there's a large impact on the decision making in Washington, D.C. By corporate interest, by think tanks, by corporate lobbyists, and one person's career that you could look at that had not been impacted by those interests was Senator Sanders, leaving him in the best position to create change in those areas. So we're talking about education, we're talking about ending private prisons, we're talking about really dramatic changes on how our country is combating climate change. We're looking at things like reforming healthcare in our country, so getting rid of the insurance lobby that, when you make a business out of healthcare, of course, if your business at the top of your list, you have profits. Down here, unfortunately, is making sure you're giving quality care to the people that you serve. And the way to invert that will be a Medicare for All system, and that's something that I really supported. That's what drew me, to inspired me to work for Senator Sanders in 2016.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that primary process didn't work out too well for us, but I casted a crowd vote for Hillary Clinton, and this year I'm watching the Democratic primary. I think we have a lot of candidates running, but I think that gives room for a lot of positive ideas to rise to the surface, and I think there are a lot of strong progressive candidates. We have Senator Sanders running again this time, but we also have some other people who are taking some pretty aggressive, um, progressive positions on some issues like ending private prisons, tuition-free public colleges and universities across the United States. So I feel very good about people like Elizabeth Warren. So she's another one that I'm watching very closely.
Yeah. What do you think of Tulsi Gabbard?
I've looked closely at Tulsi Gabbard. As a in the last year, I joined the National Guard, and I know that she is an officer in the National Guard, so I have a huge amount of respect for her for being a member, serving her country. I think she has a good stance on shoring up the country's foreign policy initiatives, especially in the Middle East, and to ensure that we can have a stronger domestic policy here inside of our country. Unfortunately, I've been pretty active in going to hear candidates, seeing them travel. Unfortunately, I haven't had the chance to meet Tulsi.
Okay.
She hasn't traveled to North Carolina or South Carolina. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing her poll very well, so it's not that I question her policy positions or question her as a candidate or if she can beat the current president. I just kind of question her viability in making it out of the primary.
Oh, well, we'll see. Yeah, I've been impressed by what I've heard from her.
Right. I have to.
Yeah.
But she's got to make her and her campaign have to. Obviously make some strategy changes to.
I thought she was strong in the
rise
debate
to the top.
the other day, and I do appreciate her foreign policy. Her stance on not getting involved in wars over oil
Absolutely.
and other. That it's
Right.
important to maintain a strong national defense, but not to get involved in unnecessary wars that
Right.
cause so much suffering and
Absolutely.
death and dying and I mean and so I do appreciate her for that and she's a very clear speaker
Absolutely. Yeah.
and it's just something interesting to watch. So in your travels and in your activities, have you come across other people in your age bracket who are also getting involved on a similar level to what
Of course.
to you and are you forming alliances? Are you helping to organize that?
Absolutely. I
element?
think the biggest resource that we have for young progressives in North Carolina has really been the success of the North Carolina Young Democrats.
The Young Democrats,
The
okay.
Young Democrats of the state of North Carolina. You have people who are involved with state executive committees. They're helping run their local parties. They're helping organize for local candidates, and some of them are running for office themselves this year. And many young Democrats ran in the general election in 2018. We're seeing our General Assembly is more the Democratic side. Is we are more diverse in age and in race than we've ever been before. But I think the greatest resource for us to organize in that state and where most young progressive Democrats are congregating to, or where there's a large concentration of us, is in the group of the Young Democrats.
The Young Democrats, that's interesting.
So,
And do they issue policy statements or
so they haven't really gotten into the realm of issuing policy statements. I would say when it comes to things like Medicaid expansion, when it came to the Born Alive bill, their president, Ann Evangelista, who actually works as a legislative assistant on Jones Street, she's been very, very good at making sure the organization makes a statement on big pieces of legislation like that. I think something good going into the future is to go ahead and have a stringent policy agenda for the Young Democrats exclusively, but every year at the North Carolina Democratic Party's executive committee meeting, that agenda is set there by the general body of the Democratic Party. So with all 100 counties together, so that's really the basis that we're going off of.
Okay.
So that includes a lot of progressive things that help young people in the state of North Carolina. So that means tuition-free community colleges across the state of North Carolina. It included Medicaid expansion. It included expanding the rights for immigrants and undocumented citizens who are in the state of North Carolina to attend our public colleges and universities with in-state tuition. Really progressive initiatives like that. So it is not short of any of the goals of the Young Democrats or as young people in general. So.
Are there other organizations that you're aware of or that you're a part of that involve people who are really active but maybe in a more nonpartisan way than the Young Democrats?
I would say so. There's plenty of organizations like Democracy North Carolina, or you have a lot of young women joining the League of Women Voters.
Really?
And the league is also seeking young men and women who are at our colleges and at our universities who can help promote their mission. Is
there a branch in Henderson?
There is a branch. There is a Henderson County branch of the League of Women Voters. So I think they're about active in almost, if not all, almost all counties here in the state of North Carolina. And I think they've been the strongest advocates for change here in the state. It's been litigants from the League of Women Voters who went to testify before the U.S. Supreme Court against gerrymandering. So, so there's organizations like that, and of course there's interest groups just like the Canary Coalition or Friends of DuPont Forest, or maybe more centrist groups like the Sierra Club that young people can join to impact their specific issue, that whether it be the environment, whether it be voting rights, whether it be education. The Literacy Council of Durham is a very strong resource for improving education. They're awesome lobbyists on Jones Street working to increase funding for teachers.
You're involved, at least for a while, and maybe you still are, with the NAACP branch.
Yes, I've been involved with the NAACP. Unfortunately, I haven't been as active as perhaps I've wanted to be. And of course, the NAACP tries to be a nonpartisan party. So some of the roles that I've taken in recent years, I can't bring my partisan work into my work of the NAACP. So that's brought in some sacrifices there.
I see. Yeah.
Of course, as a African American person, of course, I support the work of the NAACP. It's and you want to talk about things that young people should get involved in, and where a lot of young people are getting involved in the Poor People's Movement, and in North Carolina, led by Reverend Barber.
Yes.
I mean, he is the civil rights leader of our time, not only here in North Carolina but across the country. That's certainly some work that I've been following, though, in regards to the NAACP.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Down Home, North Carolina?
I am familiar with Down Home, North Carolina, and I believe their executive director, Chelsea White. They do a good job at some local activism on ensuring living wages for local workers. They're ardent activists in healthcare. So I think they are a group that would are really receptive to some of the conversations that are happening right now in regards to Medicaid expansion. So I'm familiar with the group. I know that they're run by some young rural people out here in Western North Carolina, which I think is really promising. It's very exciting. Yeah, I think there's a lot of grassroots work like that happening in Western North Carolina. I think we should do things to make sure they get more exposure. We should do things to make sure they get more funding.
Yeah.
I think organizations, whether it be the Canary Coalition or the NAACP, or even having candidates seeing what these people are doing and partnering with them would be a good thing to see.
Yeah. All right. So, is there anything else you'd like to express to our audience before we close this out?
Well, if I'd like to express anything, there's so much apathy in our country right now. So, whether it's in the environmental community, whether it's in the minority community, whether it's from the needs of poor people getting heard, no matter who you are, you have an obligation. You have an obligation to get involved. You have an obligation to see things that are happening in your life and get involved with an issue that positively impacts that, or is working to cure that problem, that is working to help your teachers get paid more, increase the funding for your local school, that's working to clean up the environment of your city or of your county. There's always a little something more that everyone can give, but I think the most important of which, and I think the most sacrifice as far as people losing their lives for, is the right to vote. So I think everyone should take a little bit of time to make sure they learn about the candidates that are running. And I'm talking about from city council to president of the United States and every office in between. And you should learn about them. And in November of this year, next year, I strongly encourage everyone, most importantly people of color and young people, to go out and vote. I think that's the most important.
Thank you, John.
All right, thank you for having me,
Good
Auburn.
pleasure.
I appreciate it.